At 4:12 in the morning, the satellites above the Caribbean should have been painting a perfect picture of the night sky, every ship wake visible, every heat signature accounted for. Instead, they went dark. Not shattered, not destroyed, blinded. 4 minutes of absolute silence at the highest level of U.S. surveillance. No one expected it. Inside the National Reconnaissance Operations Center, alarms flashed red. Telemetry collapse on Channel 7. China's signatures matched the interference pattern, an officer shouted. Russia, China, both. The timing was too perfect. When the screens finally flickered back to life, it was already too late. A Russian Il-76 cargo aircraft was on final approach into Caracas, its transponder off, its cargo sealed, its payment made not through banking channels, but through Venezuelan gold, moved quietly into a Russian vault hours earlier. What changed in that instant to alter the balance of power, and why did China join the play? Do not just watch, engage. If clear-eyed analysis matters to you, hit like and comment. For a moment, Washington believed it was an isolated incident, just a cyber flare, a probing strike, something to test U.S. resilience. But patterns emerged almost instantly. While Russia's cargo aircraft touched down in Caracas, China initiated joint naval exercises in the Western Pacific, pushing an aircraft carrier strike group closer to the first island chain. The timing wasn't coincidence, it was choreography. Inside the Pentagon's Joint Operations Center, a colonel muttered under his breath, "This is not tactical, this is strategic." The U.S. Navy repositioned an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer toward the Caribbean while an aircraft carrier in the Pacific tightened its missile defense posture. Dual theater pressure applied with mathematical precision. Meanwhile, analysts traced the gold transfer, nearly $2 billion worth moved physically, bypassing banks entirely. No SWIFT, no sanctions, no digital trail. So the question was simple and terrifying. Did Venezuela, Russia, and China just test America's limits? Could this be an irreversible mistake? At 4:50 in the morning, long after the Il-76 sealed its cargo in a Venezuelan hangar, U.S. Southern Command finally received the full satellite reconstruction of those missing 4 minutes. A Russian Project 87 7-kilo class submarine, quiet, diesel-electric, nearly invisible in shallow waters, had surfaced for less than 90 seconds near La Guaira. 90 seconds was all it needed. A small craft departed the sub, transferring 2 containers that matched the size of 9 M96E2 missile canisters, the very missiles used in Russia's S-300 and S-350 series. That meant Venezuela didn't just buy weapons with gold. It bought anti-access capability, a shield, a threat, a message. And Russia chose the exact 4 minutes when U.S. eyes were blinded to deliver it. Inside the USS Gravely, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, tasked with pushing into Caribbean waters, the captain reviewed the updated threat matrix. New Russian hardware in Venezuelan hands changes flight paths, naval lanes, and early warning integrity, the weapons officer warned. Missile defense protocols shifted instantly into a tightened posture, longer radar sweeps, expanded no-fly arcs, double-layered intercept windows. The U.S. Navy's naval power was never just force, it was presence, the constant reminder that the Western Hemisphere is not a playground for revisionist powers. But tonight, that presence was being tested. Meanwhile, Russian naval signals, intelligence ships farther east began relaying encrypted bursts aimed not at Moscow, but at Hainan, China's naval brain center in the South China Sea. That was the real revelation. Russia was feeding China real-time data from the Caribbean, while China fed Russia telemetry from the Pacific tension zone. 2 theaters suddenly operated like one. One heartbeat, one strategy, one message. At 5:20 a.m., a classified cable reached the White House Situation Room. Russia-China operational synchronization confirmed. Venezuela gold for weapons transaction validated. Caribbean Shield assets active. A lieutenant whispered the words no one wanted to hear. They're not building capacity, they're building leverage. Because the moment Venezuela acquired long-range Russian missiles paid in gold and protected by Chinese cyber cover, it created a secondary pressure front on the U.S. Navy. Stretch the U.S. Navy thin in the Caribbean, force U.S. carriers to reposition, then exploit the vacuum in the Pacific. From Beijing's perspective, it was elegant. From Moscow's perspective, it was opportunity. From Washington's perspective, it was the beginning of a war simulation turning real. Only 12 nautical miles now separated the USS Gravely from Venezuelan territorial waters, a distance a modern missile could cross in less than 3 minutes. But what waited inside those waters was still unknown. Advisory teams, new radar locks, and possible Russian personnel. And the Il-76's cargo? Still sealed, still uninspected, still dangerous. If you were the captain, would you order restraint or confrontation? Comment below. While the Caribbean heated like a pressure cooker, the real rupture formed thousands of miles away at the exact moment U.S. Analysts confirmed the Venezuelan gold for weapons transfer. China pushed its gamble. At 6:40 a.m., U.S. Indo-Pacific Command detected the Fujian, China's newest electromagnetic catapult aircraft carrier, leaving its anchorage escorted by 2 Type 055 destroyers and a screen of missile frigates fanning outward like blades. Their formation wasn't defensive. It was forward-angled, optimized for a push toward the Philippine Sea. Pacific tension surged instantly. Inside the USS Ronald Reagan's Combat Direction Center, alarms pulsed through the darkened deck. Chinese carrier group altering heading bearing 220, speed increasing. Officers exchanged tight looks. This wasn't an exercise. It was movement synchronized with Russia's Caribbean play. The U.S. Navy repositioned the entire carrier strike group. The destroyer USS Higgins shifted to launch an extended Aegis missile defense pattern, intercept windows widening to guard against China's hypersonic-capable ship killers. War simulation models updated every 60 seconds, each one showing the same brutal truth. China and Russia were running a two-ocean pressure algorithm designed to stretch US naval power to its operational edge. At 7:10 a.m., live intelligence confirmed the link. Chinese cyber teams had initiated the satellite blindout that covered Russia's Il-76 landing in Caracas. And now China was exploiting the distraction, moving its fleet as if choreographing a shadow dance across the Pacific. In the White House Situation Room, an admiral put it bluntly, "They don't need a fight. They just need us to defend two coasts at once." The implications were devastating. If U.S. missile defense assets were pulled into the Caribbean to monitor Venezuelan Russian systems, that left fewer interceptors and fewer destroyers to counter China's massive naval surge in the Pacific. And if China advanced too close to Taiwan, only an aircraft carrier strike group stood between crisis and catastrophe. Then came the flashpoint. At 7:25 a.m., a Chinese J-16D electronic warfare jet targeted a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft, a silent lock, no missile fired, but enough to force the American pilot to break altitude. Washington saw it as harassment. Beijing saw it as leverage. Moscow saw it as proof the plan was working. In dual command centers, one in Hawaii, one in D.C., the same question echoed: if we shift assets to the Caribbean, do we give China the opening it wants? Two fronts, two rivals, one strategy, and in the middle of it all, Venezuela, Russia, China, using gold, timing, and technology to probe the limits of American resolve. If you were in the Oval Office, which front would you reinforce first, the Caribbean or the Pacific? Comment your decision. By 8:20 a.m., both U.S. Northern Command and Indo-Pacific Command watched their simulation models converge into a single horrifying conclusion. Russia and China were not just coordinating timing or sharing political intent, they were merging their battlefield perception across two oceans. In the Caribbean, Venezuelan coastal radars, newly upgraded by Russian technicians, began transmitting encrypted telemetry bursts, and instead of routing to Moscow as expected, those signals reappeared inside network pathways connected to the South China Sea. At the same time, Chinese reconnaissance drones scanning the Philippine Sea sent low-frequency data that resurfaced inside Russian naval processors near the eastern Atlantic. This was not coincidence. It was a digital handshake, a deliberate fusion of sensing power, turning the Caribbean and the Pacific into one interconnected battle space. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Gravely, the radar operator stiffened when a new Venezuelan emitter lit up the screen. The bandwidth signature matched the S-350, a system far too advanced for Venezuela to acquire legally, but perfectly suited for a gold-for-weapons pipeline hidden beneath cyber camouflage. If Venezuela fielded even a partial S-350 battery, the U.S. Navy would face a long-range, multi-target missile shield capable of contesting American aircraft in minutes. Russia could never place such a system in Cuba without risking a direct nuclear standoff. Venezuela provided a loophole, gold paid for the hardware, China provided the cyber cover, and a blind 4-minute window allowed everything to move into position undetected. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, China's Type 055 destroyer activated its YJ-21 anti-ship missiles, shifting the entire balance in the Philippine Sea. The move mirrored Russia's intentions perfectly: push the U.S. Navy, overstretch its missile defense assets, and force Washington to protect two coastlines at once. Every maneuver looked like part of a single, elegant strategy designed to fracture American readiness by overwhelming it with simultaneous obligation. At 8:45 a.m., a flashing red message appeared on the Pentagon's intelligence fusion display. High probability, joint distraction strategy. China escalated pressure in the Pacific. Russia tightened an A2 divided by AD bubble in the Caribbean, and Venezuela positioned itself as the beneficiary of a weapons deal that bypassed every U.S. Sanction regime through the simplest, most primitive currency on earth, gold. Physical, untraceable, immune to SWIFT, and invisible to oversight. Then came the moment that froze every analyst. A Venezuelan frigate, previously considered one of the most outdated in the region, suddenly activated a Russian Kronos radar. Seconds later, the USS Gravely registered a targeting ping, not a missile lock. Not a launch sequence, just a quiet, deliberate test. A warning. Proof that the S-350 advisors on board were not passive observers, they were calibrating Venezuela's systems against a U.S. Navy destroyer only 12 nautical miles from the line. Inside the Gravely, voices fell to a whisper. "Sir, request guidance. Are we interpreting this as hostile intent?" The captain didn't answer immediately. He knew that one wrong interpretation could ignite a chain reaction across two oceans. Any escalation in the Caribbean would give China the opening it sought in the Pacific. Any misstep near Taiwan would embolden Russia to harden its footprint in Venezuela. For the first time in years, American commanders felt the weight of a coordinated strategy designed not to win a war, but to stretch the U.S. Navy until something snapped. Do you believe Moscow and Beijing executed a brilliant strategy tonight, or a catastrophic gamble that will come back to haunt them? Comment below. By 9:12 a.m., Washington believed it understood the contours of the crisis. Russia using Venezuela as a foothold, China escalating Pacific tension, the U.S. Navy stretched between two oceans, and the covert transfer of weapons paid through Venezuelan gold. But then the Pentagon's defensive cyber grid lit up with a warning no one anticipated: unauthorized excess attempt target, U.S. East Coast financial node. The signal didn't come from Moscow or Beijing. It came from Caracas. For a moment, analysts refused to believe it. Venezuela did not possess the technical sophistication to penetrate even a peripheral segment of U.S. economic infrastructure. But the deeper the cyber team dug, the clearer the truth became. The intrusion carried a Russian GRU signature layered with Chinese data mining architecture, a hybrid tool built by two powers but launched from a third. Venezuela wasn't the actor, it was the platform, chosen precisely because any attack traced back to it created ambiguity. Was the U.S. dealing with a proxy, an accomplice, or a victim? The target was small, a secondary payment processor in Miami, far from central systems, but it revealed something far larger. Russia and China were not just pushing military pressure, they were probing the credibility of America's financial architecture. They understood the psychological battlefield. If the Western Hemisphere's most secure networks could be tested, even symbolically, then the world might hesitate before trusting the global system the U.S. has maintained since the end of the Second World War. This crisis had moved beyond submarines, destroyers, aircraft carriers, and missile defense. It was now a confrontation over, the very foundations of global order. By 9:16 a.m., U.S. Cyber Command neutralized the breach, but the real damage had already been done not to the grid, but to perception. Seconds later, as if choreographed, the USS Gravely in the Caribbean registered a tighter, more deliberate Venezuelan radar ping, while across the Pacific, a Chinese Type 055 destroyer briefly locked onto a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft. 2 oceans, 2 pings, 2 signals delivered in perfect synchrony. Not attacks, but demonstrations, markers, probes. A reminder that Washington was being stretched to its strategic limits. Inside the White House Situation Room, an admiral finally said aloud what everyone already feared. They're not testing our ships, they're not testing our satellites, they're testing our system, our ability to defend 2 theaters while safeguarding the financial engine that keeps the world running. But the most devastating revelation arrived minutes later when a senior intelligence officer placed a sealed folder on the table. Inside was confirmation that the gold Venezuela used to pay Russia had already been re-leveraged inside a Chinese state-owned bank. China, in turn, used that gold as collateral to secure rare earth shipments for Russia. Russia then used those materials to support its weapons production. 3 nations, 3 needs, 1 closed loop built entirely outside the dollar, outside sanctions, outside the Western financial ecosystem. It was not just a weapons trade. It was not just a cyber strike. It was the architecture of an alternative system, an economic, military, and technological ecosystem operating without American oversight. And for the first time, the United States faced a coordinated strategy designed not to defeat its armies, but to challenge its role as the center of global gravity. If you were the president, which front would you counter first, cyber, economic, or naval? Share your judgment below. By 10:15 a.m., as intelligence from both oceans converged into one unified threat picture, it became impossible to deny the reality taking shape. Venezuela's gold for weapons deal was never a regional transaction. It was a strategic lever engineered by Russia and China to test the architecture of American power itself. The U.S. Navy faced pressure in the Caribbean, the Pacific simmered under China's expanding naval power, and America's financial grid had just endured a coordinated probe that carried unmistakable signatures from 2 great power rivals. For the first time in decades, the U.S. found itself confronting a crisis that did not rely on missiles or ships alone, but on the fusion of cyber warfare, economic bypass, and synchronized military movement. Inside the Pentagon, analysts pieced together the full strategy. Russia exploited Venezuela's desperation and weaponized its gold to move hardware that sanctions could never touch. China provided the cyber fog that blinded U.S. satellites long enough to guarantee delivery. Together, they built a closed loop of rare earths, gold, weapons, and influence an alternate ecosystem designed to reduce reliance on the American-led order. And beneath every move lay a single underlying objective: stretch the U.S. Navy until it could no longer maintain superiority across 2 oceans, force its aircraft carrier groups into reactive posture, strain its missile defense network, and weaken the perception that America can protect global stability. Because perception in geopolitics is everything. But here is the truth. The world often forgets. America's power is not built on a single fleet or a single base. It is built on resilience, alliances, and the ability to adapt faster than any rival. Even as tensions peaked, the U.S. Navy began repositioning its destroyers to form a dual front shield, the kind of dynamic, multi-theater flexibility that no other nation on Earth can replicate. NATO intelligence assets
The F-15 was also designed with long range in mind. Carrying 3 600-pound fuel tanks, the F-15 had a range of 3,000 miles, making it possible to fly from the continental United States to Europe without stopping or mid-air refueling. This would
Southern Command elevated surveillance to 24-hour rotational patterns, ensuring that any further Russian support entering Venezuela would be tracked, tagged, and countered. Because the core message of American strategy has never changed. Military power exists not to start wars, but to prevent them from ever igniting. Strength stabilizes, weakness invites chaos. Russia and China played a bold hand, leveraging Venezuela as the pawn, gold as the medium, cyber warfare as the smokescreen, and dual ocean coordination as the pressure tool. But history reminds us that adversaries often miscalculate when they underestimate the depth of America's alliances, the reach of its navy, and the cohesion of its command structure. The U.S. Navy remains the backbone of global order for a reason. It is the only force capable of projecting stability across both hemispheres at the same time, even under coordinated pressure. And in the end, this crisis, this fusion of gold, cyber intrusion, naval brinkmanship, and economic signaling reveals a deeper truth. The world is entering an era where conflicts are not declared with missiles, but with networks, currencies, and coordinated distractions. The real battlefield is no longer just land and sea, but the unseen systems that connect them all. So the question for viewers is this. If America hesitates for even a moment, if its resolve wavers, what fills the vacuum? Order or an alliance built on coercion, gold laundering, and hidden strategy? This is why vigilance matters. This is why readiness matters. And this is why the US Navy and NATO remain the anchors of global stability in an age where threats no longer wear uniforms, they hide in code, in trade, in shadows. If you believe strength deters chaos, subscribe and stay with us. If you see the world differently, tell us why your voice drives this conversation forward.